The astonishing outcome, and this is the killer quote, the astonishing outcome of the war in Europe had turned the United States into the patron and protector of the European empires. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, has just had its 75th anniversary summit in Washington. It was a big deal. Joe Biden claims that he brought NATO, the alliance of democracies in the world, together to oppose Russia and other autocracies around the world. Some say NATO spurned the efforts of people like Viktor Orban to negotiate or open a door to peace talks in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And certainly the final NATO communique included some hostile rhetoric towards China and a general aim for NATO to go global, with further cooperation here in the West Pacific, with moves into the West Asia, into Jordan, and also moves into Africa. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is spreading its wings of war well beyond the borders of the North Atlantic. The biggest thing for me, because my channel, the Burning Archive channel, and my name's Jeff Rich, I'm a historian, writer, and YouTube creator. The biggest thing for me is the myth making about the history of NATO. And I think it can be a difficult thing for viewers on YouTube to sort of see through some of the myth making about history at big events like this. Few of us have the time or the expertise to go back and check the sources of the history to know whether it's really true, and to work through the distortions of that history. But in this video, I want to show you how you can do that too, by checking out some of the better quality of histories, and so discovering some of the big lies, dark secrets, and true histories of NATO's 75 years of endless war. Now, you may be wondering, who is this random YouTuber who's commenting on NATO's history, and how on earth can he say such things? But let me quote for you from a very serious history of NATO, published on its 70th anniversary by Timothy Sale, a historian of international relations in Canada, in a book called The Enduring Alliance, NATO and the History of Post-War Global Order. There he writes that the democratic nature of allied governments, or some democratic styling of the alliance itself, has long been assumed as the glue that kept NATO together. But the historical records reveal a darker, deeper, and more complex relationship between democracy and NATO. And we'll get to that darker relationship a little bit later on in the video. So the general story of the NATO as the alliance of democracies, it's quite reasonable for you and for me to question some of the stories that are given to us about NATO's history. And at the NATO's 75th anniversary, there was certainly a lot of myth-making. And I think perhaps this is most concisely put in a brief speech or talking points made by Jake Sullivan, the United States of America's National Security Advisor, really the one of the primary agents of the American foreign policy at the moment. He presented a kind of origin story of NATO at one of the public events at the NATO Forum. In fact, this particular public event was arguably the most important public event at the NATO Forum. Public forum. It was the NATO Defence Industry Summit. And this is the description of the nature of the post-1945 world and the reasons that NATO was formed in those years. NATO was formed in 1949. The world was shifting. So these are Jake Sullivan's words. The world was shifting. Nazi Germany had fallen. The Soviet Union was rising. Communism was spreading. Nations were rebuilding. And people everywhere were reckoning with the horrors of the Holocaust. So our predecessors gathered here in Washington, and together they signed the North Atlantic Treaty, creating what would become the most powerful alliance in the history of the world, NATO. Now, it's a beautifully crafted story. It's an extraordinarily simplified fairy tale. And in many ways, it's quite grotesque in some of its misconstructions of both the history of the First World War and I guess its moral blindness to the challenges facing the world in 1945 to 1949, the situation in which the original North Atlantic Treaty partners decided to form a military alliance to deal with the problems of the world at that time. Let's take a few things. Had Nazi Germany fallen, or had it been defeated? And who exactly had defeated that Nazi Germany? It's widely acknowledged and well documented in statistics that the principal agent of the defeat of Nazi Germany was the Soviet Union, that power that America, or Jake Sullivan, described as rising in the post-1945 world. The Soviet Union had lost 1 in 7 of its people in the Second World War, or the Great Fatherland War, as it's known as in Russia. Was it really rising, or was it just getting up? And its own cities, its own infrastructure had been seriously damaged. 1 million people had died in the siege of Leningrad, which went on for 3 years, in which people starved to death. So was this nation really rising, or was it simply getting up off its feet? Was it not just recovering from some of the horrors that Jake Sullivan described? And Germany and Japan had been both firebombed and their states eliminated, creating quite a strategic vacuum in both Central Europe and the Western Pacific. And despite what Jake Sullivan says about dealing with the horrors of the Holocaust, although that was undoubtedly true in many people's moral consciences, it is also true that some of the commanding officers of NATO were former soldiers of Nazi Germany, and of course that America had dropped a nuclear bomb on Hiroshima. So Sullivan's story really obscures, I think, the real story of NATO. It obscures it, and it comes back, it ends on this story that they created what would become the most powerful alliance in the history of the world. Was that true, or was in fact the alliance that had previously been formed between the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States of America, which had defeated Italy, Japan, and Nazi Germany, was that not arguably a more powerful and more successful alliance in the history of the world? It's, after all, the most destructive war in human history. A lot of myth-making at the NATO summit. And I think there are particularly 2 big lies that are talked about frequently at this NATO summit. One is an extension of this idea that NATO is the strongest alliance in world history. Have a think yourself if someone is boasting to you in that way, whether you would really take them at face value. And there is another extraordinary claim that has been made at the NATO 75th anniversary summit, which is that NATO is now the longest lasting military alliance in world history. Now, this turns out also to be a big lie. I actually fact-checked this claim by trying to find the actual sources of the information on which it was based. There were a number of stories in the Western media, I think maybe around the time of the 70th anniversary of the NATO summit, that talked about this longest-lasting alliance. And they all seem to go back to a document prepared by a US military officer for the Brookings Institute about 10 years ago, in which there was a military or database created of military alliances in world history. However, they all date really from about 1480. NATO is claiming that the previous record was set by the Delian alliance between Athens and Sparta, but this military database, this source on which the claim initially seems to have been based, really is post-1480 and almost entirely Europe. And what's more, the database also includes reference to an alliance between France and the Ottoman Empire that lasted for 250 years. So even the most basic source checking and fact checking of NATO's claim proves that it was false. And then the other, I guess, big lie about NATO is that it is a defensive alliance. Many people in commenting on the 75th anniversary have talked about its extraordinarily warlike character if this is a defensive alliance. It bombed Serbia, intervened in the internal affairs of Serbia, bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999. It sent expeditionary forces into Iraq and Afghanistan. Of course, its eastward expansion, its aggressive eastward expansion towards Russia's borders since 1991 can only really be characterized as aggressive, or if not aggressive, certainly expansive. And I guess that is also the concern many people have about NATO now going global, NATO now sort of putting China on its list of hostile powers and wanting to establish bases of operation in South Pacific, the Indo-Pacific, the West Pacific, Africa, West Asia, indeed the entire world. After all, this defensive alliance, the principal army of this defensive alliance, the principal military force of this defensive alliance comes from the United States, which has 800 to 1,000 military bases in dozens and dozens and dozens of countries around the world. Doesn't sound too defensive to me. So they're the two big lies, I think, about NATO and NATO's history. But when we look at NATO's history, I think we can also, if we look at some quality world history, including the book The Enduring Alliance and one other book that I will tell you about shortly, come up with some different stories. And there are, I think, then three dark secrets to NATO's history. So I'm going to share three dark secrets of NATO's history over the last 75 years. Now, the first of those is NATO is not formed in courage, it's not formed in honour, it's not formed in brave defence of democracy. It is founded in fear. Now, let's listen to the generally fairly sympathetic history of NATO by Timothy Sale to just clarify what I mean by that. So I read before his quote that, there was a darker, deeper and more complex relationship between democracy and NATO. The following sentence in that introductory sort of section of Sale's book reads as follows. The Allies did not maintain NATO because it was an alliance of democracies, but because it offered the best insurance against the dangers of democracy. A fickle electorate that in seeking peace might pave the way for war. Now, does that rhetoric sound familiar to you? Isn't that some of the rhetoric being used, for example, against Viktor Orban's efforts to establish peace talks? And Sale, that is, also expands upon that, because the idea that NATO was formed defensively to prevent a Soviet threat to Western Europe. The rising Soviet Union, the spreading communism of Jake Sullivan's earlier remarks is foundational to its idea that it's basically a force for good in the world, and that it protected the world against this aggressive army which had just lost 1 in 7 of its people in a most horrific war and was deeply impoverished and had to rebuild its society. What does he say? He says here, and I'll just read this paragraph, to ask if NATO deterred the Red Army from marching down the Champs-Élysées or occupying the Channel ports, however, is to ignore just what Allied leaders thought the NATO organisation and its military force achieved. According to Robert A. Ford, a distinguished Canadian diplomat who served as the Dean of Ambassadors in Moscow and as an advisor to NATO on Soviet affairs, it was a myth that what NATO had actually done was prevent a military invasion. The real threat to Europe had been the political disintegration of the Allies, and this is what NATO had prevented. Now, Joe Biden is boasting at the moment that he's brought NATO back together. That NATO is stronger than it's ever been, that there's a strong, mutual partnership between Europe and North America now in NATO. Arguably, he's echoing the same theme. Sale continues, Ford's analysis was not unique. It was shared widely in the alliance from the 1940s through to the early 1990s. Even the State Department's champions of an Atlantic Pact, men like Theodore Achilles, recalled, I don't think there has ever been any serious danger of an all-out Soviet armed attack west of the West German frontier. The danger has been, and still is, that the Russians can resort to subversion and political blackmail backed by the threat of force. The great fear of NATO's leaders throughout the Cold War and beyond was not that the Soviet Union or Russia would launch an invasion of Europe. Instead, that they feared that Moscow might threaten, even apply the use of force, and that would weaken, the political control of their societies. That's one meaning of the fear, but I guess when one also looks at, I think it's important to try to get a global perspective on the history of NATO in this time. And this book here, After Tamerlan, The Rise and Fall of Global Empires 1400 to 2000, which I've referred to a few times on the channel as in many ways the best history book to give you a guide to, the geopolitics of today's world, the deeper world history of today's geopolitics, to really understand how the post-1945 world came into being. This book makes the point that NATO was formed out of a position of fear and strategic weakness. It was not because the Soviet Union was threatening the West, but it was because NATO partners feared that they could not counter the Soviet Union, both the spread of communism to Western Europe, the desire for peace in European populations ravaged by war, and the inability of America to really actually deploy its military forces into Europe against a threat. And what's more, historians have examined and never found any real intention of the Soviet Union to expand aggressively into Western Europe. They secured, I guess, the entry points into the Soviet Union, in which it had been invaded by Germany and during the Russian Civil War by Britain, America and others, by Napoleon and in the Crimean War. But they were doing that defensively. So what is this defensive alliance getting alarmed by the defence of their former ally? So NATO was formed in fear. And the other fear that they had was that in the turbulent post-1945 world, North America and the European powers, Western European powers, could lose their grip on world power. They, in a way, created out of their fear and their ideological rivalry with both the Soviet Union and ultimately the People's Republic of China. And this is an element of the story that is completely left out of Jake Sullivan's story about NATO. They also feared the loss of power and wealth of the still existing colonial empires of both Europe and, in many ways, the United States. Indeed, NATO, and this is its second dark secret, is really formed in acceptance by the United States, an acceptance of imperial power by the United States, both for itself and its worldwide projection of power, and in collaboration with the other European powers. And this is most simply identified by looking at some of the powers of NATO and what their actual function in the world, what their colonial possessions in the world were in 1949. So there were 12 founding members of NATO: Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, Britain, and the United States of America. Okay, so Belgium had colonies in 1949. The Belgian Congo, the most notorious exploitation, perhaps, famously so in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. That is the Belgian Congo. Modern Rwanda, Burundi, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, I think that's still its name, they were all part of the imperial possessions of Belgium in 1949. Canada, no. Denmark controlled Greenland. France had colonies in 1949. It still has a colony in New Caledonia in the Indo-Pacific, the free and open Indo-Pacific. It has and has long had a semi-imperial relationship to the countries in Africa, in West Africa, in the Sahel, and it's recently been thrown out of that. Iceland, I'm not so sure. Italy was, I guess, joining NATO after its disgrace of the Mussolini fascist years, which were partly about Italy forming empires in Africa. Luxembourg probably doesn't count. The Netherlands had colonies in 1949, a colony very close to where I live, Australia, in Indonesia, a very critical place in the world. Norway, I don't know about Norway. Portugal had colonies in 1949. It had colonies in Africa, Angola, Mozambique, what was then known as Portuguese Guinea. It had a colony in East Timor, right next to Indonesia. East Timor, only that whole situation was really only resolved in the early 1990s, late 1990s. It had a colony on a former treaty port in China, Macau, which remained a colony like Hong Kong until 1999. 1949. And the African and other Portuguese colonies really only unwound in the mid-1970s. And indeed, Portugal was not a democracy in 1949. It was a dictatorship under Salazar, a curious dictatorship. And so its role in NATO was not to defend democracy. Its role in NATO was to be this global empire with critical areas in the Indo-Pacific and in Africa. Britain is still, Churchill fought World War II in order to keep the British Empire for a few more generations. And it had both the very powerful relationships with its white dominions, including Australia, as well as other colonies around the world, although it had just lost India in 1947, part of the catastrophic unwinding. But Britain had imperial possessions in Southeast Asia, in Africa, and in many parts of the world in the free and open Indo-Pacific. And of course, the United States had the colonies of Philippines and Cuba and Puerto Rico, and although it formerly did not have colonies, it was had a military governorship controlling Japan. It was establishing military bases in the Philippines and was projecting its power all around the world, as we'll see. So what happens in the years between 1945 and 1949 in the formation of NATO is actually an astonishing shift in American anti-imperial attitudes, if you like, and a new partnership between the United States as a world power that explicitly saw itself as dominating the world and in real terms perhaps dominated the world's economy, its military, etc., more so than at any other time in its history. A partnership between America, the United States of America, and the European empires to enforce a new American world system. And here, let me just read from John Darwin's book, After Tamerlane, which brilliantly presents this important part, the dark secret of the story. And I should add that in just introducing this quote, that it's important to note that these empires, although they sound powerful, were also crippled by the costs of war, the loss of India in the case of the British Empire, and the need to rebuild their economies against this gargantuan competitor of the United States, who they did see as, displacing them in their role in the world. And what's more, the colonies of these European powers and the dominions like Australia, the Commonwealth of the British Commonwealth, was going to be a crucial source of the economic reconstruction of the European powers, the resources, the commodities, all that sort of thing. The sort of trade zones that were formed within these European powers were critical to the rebuilding of the demolished Europe after Second World War. But, okay, let me read here then the quote. But staying on was not an easy option. It was bound to cost money and divert precious resources from reconstruction at home. In Southeast Asia, it meant rebuilding colonial power in the face of resistance movements that had originally sprung up against Japan's occupation. Leaning as they did on America's financial help, the unrepentant imperialists would scarcely have dared defy a veto from Washington. They had no need to fear, as Truman and his advisors grasped what they saw as the Soviet challenge. Their view of Europe's colonialism turned almost full circle. It no longer seemed wise to force their European friends to abandon their assets. When the British sought help, With the burden of military aid to Turkey and Greece, Washington responded with the Truman Doctrine to share the burden of containment in the Mediterranean and Middle East. The American chiefs of staff urged all feasible political, economic, and if necessary military support to the United Kingdom and the communications of the British Commonwealth. At $1 billion a year, the United States underwrote the costs of defending Britain's overseas empire, quietly approving Britain's imperial presence in the Middle East. Iran, Palestine, all that sort of thing, partly related to these events. By the late 1940s, large tranches of aid were propping up France's struggle to keep Indochina French. The astonishing outcome, and this is the killer quote, the astonishing outcome of the war in Europe had turned the United States into the patron and protector of the European empires, although a patron which expected that sooner or later their imperial economies would be opened up to its own. So this is the dark secret of NATO's history. NATO is formed as the military alliance, not of democracies, but of a new American global world system and the European empires, not just in Europe, but are governing still large parts of the world, extracting resources from large parts of the world that are fighting resistance movements in Africa, Asia, and I guess in the South and Central America. And so this brings me to the third dark secret, which I guess is evident in that story that I just told you about NATO's real history being this sort of the United States being the patron of European empires, as the distinguished historian of empire, widely recognised best historian of empires, John Darwin, says that America becomes the patron of the European empires in order to both contain the Soviet Union, or arguably to conduct its ideological crusade against the Soviet Union, and also to open up those empires to American free trade. So the third dark secret is that NATO has never only been about European security. NATO has always been about the Euro-Atlantic controlling the Indo-Pacific. It has always been, NATO has always been the enforcement arm of American global power in partnership with the Euro-Atlantic. It has always been going global right from the get-go in 1949. Now, it's going through a new dangerous phase of that at the moment, but I think we can also see if we realise this dark secret of the history, we can really see the deceptive nature of some of the rhetoric that is coming from NATO about the China threat. I think if you really want to get a good understanding of the true history of NATO, I think it is this book as much as anything that I would recommend that people read. I've recommended it before on the channel. It brilliantly conveys the uncertainty, the contingency, the wreckage of the world that the world was in 1945. The post-1945 world is being turned into this simple myth, such as the things that Jake Sullivan was talking about before, but it is actually an extraordinary complex story of conflict and competing tensions between different powers around the world. And John Darwin's book, After Tamerlane, The Rise and Fall of Global Empires 1400 to 1600, absolutely conveys that brilliantly. What he also conveys is the astonishing aggressive, maybe expansive, certainly, nature of the expansive expansion of American power after 1945. He says the breakneck expansion of American power was somewhat surprising, but the result was the creation of an American system, imperial in all but name. In 1946, plans were laid for a naval command in the Mediterranean. In 1947, the Truman Doctrine promised military help to Turkey and Greece against Soviet pressure, and Marshall Aid pledged the means to restore the battered Western European economies. In early 1948, Washington signalled its readiness to negotiate an Atlantic Pact that would commit it to the defence of Western Europe, and the Vandenberg Resolution gave the Senate's blessing. In April 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty was signed, and 2 years later, American troops were deployed for the landward defence of Western Europe. There were parallel commitments in Canada, over which ran the shortest air route to the Soviet Union. So it's not just Canada being a democracy that matters for it to be in NATO. And East Asia, where the Mutual Security Pact with Japan was signed in 1951. By that year, in fact, the system's main elements had been put in place. It was not symmetrical. It comprised a close alliance with Britain, the key European member of the North Atlantic Pact, and a defensive partnership with other West European states. West Germany, whose army was under effective American command, and Japan, where America enjoyed far-reaching extraterritorial rights, were semi-protectorates. The Philippines, technically independent from 1946, granted America control over some 23 bases and undertook not to grant them to anyone else without American agreement. It was a real, if not nominal, protectorate. Micronesia in the Pacific was retained under Washington's direct supervision for the sake of its bases, especially Guam, America's fortress in the Western Pacific, guarding its route to Japan and the Philippines. We could add to this list America's vast sphere of informal empire in Latin America, where the war had brought the final extinction of Britain's commercial presence. The Rio Treaty of 1947, the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance, provided for military aid from the United States against both armed attack and other forms of aggression towards the Latin American states. In the 1950s, only 3 Latin American governments maintained diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. This colossal imperium was on an unprecedented scale. No previous world power had entrenched itself at both ends of Eurasia or had the power to do so. This is the true dark history of NATO. It, as John Darwin says later in the book, it begins the Cold War, but we need to rewrite our concepts of the Cold War. Perhaps we even need to jettison the term the Cold War. John Darwin says the Cold War had been the great age of American expansion, and NATO was the central enforcement arm of that expansion, in combination with the Euro-Atlantic Empire, or European empires all around the world, and in order to maintain economic, political, and military control, not just of European security, but of the Indo-Pacific, Africa, and the entire world. So I hope that's given you some insights into some of the lies that have been told about NATO's history on its 75th anniversary, some of the dark secrets of NATO's history, and at least 2 books that you can go to get a different perspective, a truer perspective, and a very accessible perspective on the history of NATO and its role in the world today, in world history today, in this crazy world today. Histories that can actually help you make sense of this crazy world today with some quality world history and a little bit of literature thrown in. If you would like to do a bit of a read along with me on John Darwin's After Tamerlan, why don't you leave me a comment below? That crucial chapter in John Darwin's book on the post-1945 world, how it was really made, I think will bring a lot of insight. So leave a comment below. And also subscribe to my Substack, jeffrich.substack.com.